Hi, and welcome back to Plan 9 Crunch. I am Joe Gibson, and today we are going to talk about a now 2-year-old film I very clearly remember watching in theaters as if it were last week. The Last Voyage of the Demeter impressed me as my pick for Movie of the Year of 2023 until Godzilla Minus One came along, for reasons I shall struggle to explain for the duration of this video. Directed by André Øvredal, hope I'm pronouncing that decently, this film set out to adapt the Captain's Log chapter of Dracula, where death, paranoia, and a Dracula tear apart the crew of the ship transporting Dracula and his boxes of dirt until only the captain remains, tying himself to the wheel. This is actually a seldom adapted set piece from the novel, so it made sense to try and adapt it into a film. The problem is this film did so absurdly poorly at the box office that nobody who hasn't read the book and seen a Dracula movie has seen this movie. There are all sorts of reasons for why it flopped, potentially, such as the natural disadvantage of R-rated films, or the unfortunate placement as the second of 2 disconnected Dracula films within months of each other, or the serious horror competition that year, or the production hell this movie cycled through for about 2 decades before finally releasing in 2023. Perhaps people didn't like the foregone conclusion, everybody dies nature of this premise, but this movie always had great potential. The tense, claustrophobic idea of a thriller horror scenario where the monster is on a ship with you fuels the suspense of the Alien franchise, and the fact that everybody dies means anything can happen and most likely will in the most horrible way possible. The second that the trailer shows a child and a dog, a movie like this already has its tendrils in you, which makes for effective horror. However, for the premise to function, certain key elements need to be clear to the audience. Chief among them, the characters involved, the external stakes of how Dracula kills, the internal stakes for the characters, as well as logistics of the ship's general layout. Every story needs this to some degree, and it often amounts to dense exposition dumps where a character will explain a part of the plot to another character. I criticize whenever this breaks immersion and is done only for the audience's benefit in the form of as-you-know dialogue, because it warps the characters involved in a notable, unnecessary way. By that same token, I praise when a film is able to integrate exposition in a way that makes sense and is true to the characters involved as they are established to act in the movie. And that is what impressed me about this film on the first viewing. How the film meticulously seems to deliver exposition optimally and in ways that were realistic without breaking the immersion. But here has been my difficulty in articulating this for the last 2 years. How do I explain this outside of just asserting it? If I were to write an essay, I would have to explain the larger moving pieces of the plot and cause and effect of the story in more detail since few people watch this movie. Then cite the expository dialogue, extrapolate a specific argument with more context, do all that for the most important plot points in the film, and have introductory and concluding paragraphs. Hence this semi-scripted YouTube video format. I will give the necessary context since the film's box office failure means few of you watched it, and then try to illustrate in an auditory medium how this film excels in its exposition. So for some context. First, this movie is actually produced by DreamWorks. Somehow, I thought they did cartoons, but both this and Tropic Thunder exist as live-action DreamWorks releases, which is just funny to me that someone could watch this, then Tropic Thunder, and The Bad Guys 2 back to back to back as part of a DreamWorks marathon. Anyway, in any case, The Captain's Log is part of Chapter 7 of the original Dracula, published and set in 1897. Dracula has to transport himself and his boxes of dirt to England, and he does this through the ship the Demeter on a voyage from Varna to Whitby. In the chapter, the captain keeps a record of the day's proceedings involving the disappearance of crewmate Petrovsky and the instance where other crewmate Olgarin notices a tall stranger. Dracula. Eventually, everyone dies, likely killed by Dracula, and the captain ties himself to the wheel with a cross around him. So, at the very least, what you know going in from having read the book is that everyone will die. One of them is the captain, and 3 others are named Petrovsky, Abramov, and Olgarin. This film also adds in a few characters, such as Black Dr. Clemens, played by Corey Hawkins, who is essentially the hero of the story, and whose backstory we also have to learn through careful reveals in the acting, performance, as well as diegetic exposition. So the first bit of exposition in the film takes the form of text on screen that reads, "In 1897, a Russian schooner was chartered to carry private cargo consisting of 50 wooden crates from Romania to England. When the ship arrived, it was derelict. The name of the vessel was Demeter, and this is the story of its crew, based on the captain's log from the novel Dracula." An introductory wall of text, or a title crawl, or an opening narration are common forms of exposition to orient the reader in the story. That I'm sure you can think of examples done really poorly or really well, but lest the point get away from me. All this text is saying is what I already told you. The book is set in 1897. Dracula is transporting himself in boxes of dirt to sleep in, and everyone, or functionally everyone on the ship, will die. As I mentioned, this film was a flop, specifically only making about $22 million against a $45 million budget. And thus, everyone who actually watched the movie already knows this, but it is necessary to reiterate going in. Interestingly, the text on the screen dates this discovery of the ship to August 6th, which I initially thought was erroneous, because the captain's log chapter dates the reporting, the newspaper publication of the Demeter's arrival to the 8th, but the previous chapter material on the 6th shows characters observing the ship's arrival on the 6th. So there is some pretty good attention to detail, even though the film does change some stuff. I am not claiming there's no anachronisms. That's not under the purview of this exercise for me to investigate. The characters who will find the Demeter, they find the captain's account, which we will later see him write in the movie, but this account also will fill the role of guiding narration for much of the film until it switches to a different character's narration at the end to represent a shift. Anyway, I will now summarize a bit more of the movie and move into the more analytic part of this. In Varna, the Demeter loads up the cargo and needs extra hands, catching the interest of Clement, a doctor, who ingratiates himself with the crew and ends up helping a stowaway that is essentially Dracula's snack to make it through the voyage. As more people die, the crewmates have to try to survive and eventually decide if they will try to fight or flee. Some characters fight, some characters flee, and they all pretty much die. Anyway, the ship. First, the setting of the ship is important to effectively communicate to the audience with the ship's spatial layout, as well as its relationship to cargo and to its crew. Basically, a crewmate or two will have to keep watch on the main deck every night, which may involve fiddling with the sails or beams where they used to hang pirates and mutineers. Well below holds cargo and some rooms, as well as the captain's quarters. Notably, because the ship is wooden, the characters can communicate through knocks on the wood that reverberate throughout the ship, contributing to the atmosphere and being one facet of the movie that can only be done on a seafaring vessel as opposed to spaceships of the Alien franchise. Now, if the captain were to take Wojciech, that's his first mate, aside and say, "First mate of mine, as you know, this is how our ship works," that would be cheap and actually bad writing. If the captain were to write that in his log/narration, that would set the precedent that he would describe everything in detail and conflict with later moments in the movie where vagueness is necessary to build dread. What the film does instead is have an overjoyed and clearly proud of his grandfather, the captain, Toby, explain this in detail to Clemens, an outsider and new hire to the ship, but also the man that just saved Toby's life and is humoring the child by hanging out with him. When I talk about how the film uses exposition well, I am referring to this and other such instances where it is not only natural for the characters to say what they say and do what they do, but also additive to those characters in how they do it. The simple plot mechanic and utility of that plot mechanic in being expressed also yields dividends for the characters. The pride that Toby shows in being part of the ship is not only to justify the exposition, but it pays off with his own character development and mobility in the story. Toby promises to keep watch over the animals and feels like a failure when they die. And most depressingly, later on, at around an hour into the movie, the captain wants to keep Toby safe and help him feel useful, so he gives him his spyglass to polish. Toby being in the captain's quarters to clean the spyglass leads to him encountering the vampirized Olgarin and returning to those quarters where Dracula hunts and kills him. The organic exposition of this movie not only introduces the plot material required, but also sets up and enables later payoffs in the film's plot and character writing. While I'm on the subject of Toby, the connection between the captain and Toby is clear from their first scene, but the film reiterates that with some ADR where Toby refers to the captain as his grandfather explicitly. I will criticize that slightly, but this is the part of any analysis where we remember this film was in development hell for 20 years, and ADR reshoots are always going to be a part of that. The aforementioned aspects of the ship will lay the groundwork for almost every kill scene, and the maintenance the crew members periodically have to do on the sails foreshadows the final confrontation of the movie. And the movie explains the ship's attributes and responsibilities to us, and shows us how that works organically before it is important to leverage that for the terror. Dracula is also a part of this movie that has to be somewhat explained and also built up to. Our first indication of anything truly sinister is brief snippets of dialogue in the Roma workers, their fear of staying with the Demeter cargo past sunset as they're loading it up, and their offering of money and prayers to leave early. The old half-blind worker that Wojciech chose to spite Clemens exposits that there is more to Dracula's dragon mark crest that's on all the boxes than just the cameras lingering on it. That some people in Varna recognize the symbol for what it is, but the danger at this point is still contained to the half-blind man nearly dropping the box of dirt on Toby. Again, we know going in who Dracula is, but the different adaptations come with different specifics, and we will need to learn about the specific Dracula. But it would be immersion-breaking to have guided narration about that right now. So what we get is knowledgeable characters acting cautiously, and we can think about why they're acting that way. Next, the film shows animals, especially rats, first through presence and then absence, to denote the increasing threat level. The animals, Toby tends to panic when Dracula first begins feeding. And initially, the crewmates cannot sleep without rats nearby, but Dracula kills all the animals in a spectacular spree, and then the absence of the established rats also indicates more feeding has occurred, building the suspense while adding to what we know about Dracula without spelling everything out yet. It is around this time that Clemens finds Roma woman stowaway Anna in one of the boxes of dirt. Clemens, from his initial diagnosis of her, knows that blood is necessary for her to stave off the infection. And in that prickly sensation of dramatic irony, we, the audience, understand why that is and where this is all going. She is still passed out, and we know that when she awakes, that will raise the stakes because she will be able to tell us more information. And the first time we see Dracula, he is looking for her. Since she is not in the box of dirt, Dracula will have to feed elsewhere. And this is all escalating logically. As I guess I spoiled early on in the voyage, Olgarin has to be the first to see Dracula. And as the movie has not positioned him as the main character, it seems like he can die, but I also spoiled that he's not the first to die, it's always Petrovsky. So the more important part of this scene for the building tension and exploration of Dracula as a menace is the implementation of the knocking as Olgarin tries to, for another look at Dracula, and Clemens tries to find Dracula. Or Olgarin, whoever's there. Throughout his first scenes and kills, Dracula comes off as quite feeble, needing to grow in strength and vitality before he can stand up straight, sprout wings, or speak, but he does all of these things later to raise the stakes. And after the kill of Petrovsky, Anna also wakes up and begins to share information with the group, firmly getting us into the vampire story. This is around 44 minutes into the film. The weakest part of this film, of how this film communicates this Dracula concept is that his dialogue is so quiet. I did not know he had any upon my first viewing in the theater. In any case, his nightmarish design effectively visually establishes his demonic qualities that otherwise dialogue would insist upon without showing in these movies, and the actual dialogue he does have shows off knowledge and disdain for Christianity, which is more important for the main story of the novel than that of this movie, but I digress. Before I get into some other characters, Olgarin is important to discuss, even if I think he is merely par for the course in this type of story. He is one of the crew members that best demonstrates the kind of friendly environment that the ship is for Toby, and his disagreements with Clemens are far nicer than anyone else's, but the exposition explaining his character is in throwaway lines, where he has taught Toby some Romani words or has a daughter Anna's age. It is to the point where Olgarin's main utility is to show off what Dracula can do, mimicking the crewmates' knocking and speech, and also turning those he bites into undead hive mind zombie drones. For the record, Anna is undergoing the process of what happens to Olgarin, but Clement is better able to treat her because it's more shallow bites, so her condition takes longer to progress the same way. The earlier line of blood being necessary to solve the infection explains why Olgarin, who we do not see sufficient transfusion treatment for, turns much faster. Olgarin's death in the sunlight also establishes that weakness for the vampires, which is technically a boon for the characters to counteract their losses, but actually translates into making things worse because sunlight will claim a vampire Toby and Anna, not Dracula, in very depressing deaths. The movie would be a lot worse off if at some point, unprompted, Anna would have just said that vampires burn in sunlight without showing it, And similar to how Toby's consistent characterization served the exposition and the impact of the story, so too are the other sunlight deaths crucial and visceral to this story. Next, Wojciech is the first mate of the ship. He clearly has a poor opinion of Clemens, Anna, and the Roma people he encounters in general early on. But the captain, in delegating and dealing with those people to Wojciech, has a high opinion of him, taking Wojciech aside and telling him he plans to retire and appoint Wojciech as his successor. In an instance of dramatic irony, we know, well, the captain is correct, this will be his final voyage. We also know this will be the last of the Demeter as well. So this goal and established motivation for Wojciech to take over as captain will be in vain, and tragically circumvented. When Clemens emerges from the cargo hold with an ill stowaway, Wojciech is quite cold, but raises a valid point. You could have any number of diseases. For the next bit of the movie, Wojciech now most consistently contrasts Clemens, and that Wojciech is pragmatic in caring about resources while holding grudges. But Clemens genuinely wants to save and help people. I mentioned how the dialogue exposition largely serves not only to enhance plot, but also characters, and the film is definitely trying that with Wojciech. He insists upon no delays and no stopping at port until they arrive, because they have been promised a bonus for arriving in a timely manner, which I think is supposed to explain why they never do stop, even after people start dying, but your mileage may vary on this plot point. A lot of these dwindling cast-style thrillers have to rely on at least one character making a really dumb decision to prolong the suffering, and that has to be established as early on as possible to make sense and keep the story intact. For example, in the Agatha Christie story, 10 Little Indians, one of the eventual victims chooses to trust the wrong person on that island, which leads to the rest of the novel's deaths. I think this works well enough for this movie, but there is also a bit more to the relationship between Wojciech and Clemens that we'll have to discuss. During the attack of Vampire Ogaran, Wojciech has to save Clemens from the monster at one point in the battle, and they have to witness Toby's attack together, with Anna, another person Wojciech doesn't like, being the only one to open the door. She grabs a gun and shoots the door when they're trying to unlock it. To recover Toby's body, Wojciech, as well as the rest of the crew, is very disheartened at Toby's condition. And in a reverse of earlier scenes, Clemens is the pragmatic one, explaining why Toby likely is what Ogaran became and might need to be removed. Then, to make matters worse, the captain visibly gives up on life, and Wojciech notices Toby has died. Then, witnessing the funeral, that amounts to a dead Toby waking up and setting on fire. Wojciech previously told Clemens that if he were to kill Vampire Toby, he should look him in the eyes as he does it, and as Clemens drops the flaming Toby into the sea, he is looking directly at him. But that whole affair is enough to render the captain bedridden, and Clemens takes Wojciech aside in the captain's stead to explain the plan to destroy Dracula. You may or may not recall in the book, the captain and the entire crew search for Dracula, don't find him, and then just go back to partying and dying. In this, it's a more targeted effort where it's Clemens and Anna. And the captain has really nothing to do with anything outside of tying himself to the steering wheel. And this is where Clemens finally does open up to Wojciech, though I will save Clemens' part of that for his own analysis right after this. Just know that during this conversation, Wojciech brings back the astronomer insult, but is visibly won over, and Clemens inspires him to take the fight to Dracula. In a leadership role over the remaining crewmates, the ultimate payoff for Wojciech is that he takes an axe to the ship he wanted nothing more than to inherit. And now, Clemens, the main character of the movie, and the one we learn the most about, but it's staggered over the course of the movie, and you'll see what I mean as I explain this. Only after the plot has developed and these characters have suffered trials in close proximity to each other does Clemens explain his full backstory to Wojciech. But the film builds up to those reveals and the larger character development of the scientific man forced to confront the supernatural consistently throughout the narrative. Whether or not this counts as exposition in the more general sense, describing this film's story and plot necessarily implicates Clemens' character, and the film explores him more so than just telling us about him. Clemens' introduction is looking off for something better and going back into a poker game, but choosing to leave when he hears a ship needs more people. When pitching himself for the job, he mentions he has skills useful to working on a ship, especially as their doctor. And he doesn't clarify exactly why, but he tries to sell the idea that he'd be good for the ship. And when they reject him for the position, he watches them load cargo and is in the right place at the right time to save Toby from a falling crate. but choosing to risk his own life to save the boy. He follows Toby's tour of the ship with good nature and interacts with the others, especially Cook Joseph with a smile and enough knowledge of seafaring and Joseph's religion to fit in. Clemens' early dialogue about his situation is more guarded, especially due to the clear disdain Wojciech has for him during the aforementioned attempted recruitment, simply saying he learned at the University of Cambridge and offering his medical and astronomy knowledge. Wojciech has quite a reaction to the astronomy part of that. In any case, the movie uses the visual language of film to communicate the disadvantages Clemens faces with the clearly unsuitable man that Wojciech hired instead of Clemens, and that is why I do not find it weird how there's a diversion of how can Clemens ensure he gets on the ship in a movie where we know he'll get on the ship, when otherwise that would be pointless. It establishes the character and his perspective, also informing why he'll gravitate toward the brave Zoe Roma woman that the others look down on, and how even with his wide skills, he has certain vulnerabilities someone like Van Helsing has never really had. After the rest of the crew has had their banter about what they will spend their share of the money, then the bonus on, the captain explains that Clemens is also entitled to a share as their ship doctor, and asks what he will do with it. Again, Clemens sidesteps any real answer by saying he does not much care for money and just wants to understand the world. The captain's response, then, is somewhat prophetic for the journey Clemens goes on, that the world is not meant to be understood, but experienced and accepted, and that is when he starts to go more in detail, until the other characters move on from the moment. Clemens gets more stern and assertive in his dialogue when Wojciech protests him tending to Anna, sticking up for himself and his role as doctor. When Olgarin says the women will not be happy to have a woman on board, Clemens again is more assertive when he says the men do not need to be happy. He also sticks up for Anna when they all accuse her of killing the animals. At the same time, Clemens listens to the captain and still remains meek and good-natured to Toby and Anna. One of the other crewmates, I forget if it was Petrovsky or Abrams, or possibly Larson, they grow belligerent and call Clemens, have it in the script, I probably shouldn't say it, a very racist thing against Clemens. Pretending to be a doctor is the last part of the phrase. The normally nice Clemens is ready to fight the other crewmate, but the other crew members prevent this with a knife. This is the first explicit mention of the racism that has been implicit toward other characters' treatment of Clemens this whole time, and one can extrapolate Clemens' earlier musings about the world being a place with so much good, yet also bad, that he can't understand, to encapsulate this ship, where he enjoys the company of these men, and yet when something bad happens, the black man and the Roma girl are the first ones to be blamed. Clemens also is the only one we see console Toby after the animals die, and later on, Clemens appeals to scientific reason when discussing the weather and what Olgarin saw. An important facet of Clemens' character I would be remiss not to mention, and it's being reiterated, before it's useful, before he has to confront the idea that there is a supernatural thing and the world doesn't make sense, it's being reminded to us in dialogue conversations that are very... Anyway. After Petrovsky's death, the animosity between Wojciech and Clemens grows equally to the tender compassion of Clemens and Anna for each other. Clemens has a difficult time understanding the supernatural nature of Dracula, but cannot refuse the evidence that Dracula has fed on Anna. After Olgarin is bitten, Clemens commits himself to the idea that something is out there, whether he believes in it or not, whether they believe in it or not. And after the vampirized Olgarin attacks the ship alongside Toby's Dracula-induced death, Clemens knows he has to do something proactive to end this threat, searching the cargo hold with Anna and drafting a plan to kill Dracula. When Clemens takes Wojciech aside, he explains he was one of the first black doctors to graduate from Cambridge and applied to all the nearby hospitals, but nobody would let him practice. When he finally did get a job abroad, it turned out he was hired because they didn't know he was black, and that is why Clemens said he needs the world to make sense. And this translates in a monologue over to wanting to triumph over Dracula. And it inspires Wojciech. Wojciech is still reluctant to destroy the ship, so Clemens shares that this whole time he has been good on the ship, not because of university training, but because of family ties. Clemens, consistent with his compassion toward people, explains that the important part of a ship is the living part, and their stories. Which, what do you know, the opening title, Crawl, talked about how it was the story of the people on the ship. Anyway, this inspires Wojciech to be the one to destroy the ship. Because that's part of the plan, is to go under the deck and take an axe to it. At this point, the plan is to keep Dracula from getting to the mainland. Survive if they can, but first take away Dracula's power here. At the climax of the film, Clemens yells at Dracula that though he wants them to fear him, Dracula is actually the one that is afraid of death, pretending to be God when it is just an inversion. This successfully riles up Dracula, who bares its wings, giving away any advantage of surprise, and charged at Clemens, leaving his back turned for Anna to shoot it. As Dracula recovers and holds Clemens in a chokehold, the latter says he does not fear him, and the former promises he will, but Anna saves Clemens again by sabotaging the rig to trap Dracula there. Clemens finally has to watch the woman he has grown to care for and protect fall to her infection and burst into flames as he becomes the sole survivor outside of Dracula, who Clemens tracks onto the mainland, vowing to kill Dracula if it's the last thing he does. The narration now belongs to Clemens as he reflects on the goodness and evil in the world. Specifically, that there's evil, but there's also people like Anna that are so devoted to goodness that they'll give their lives to stop the evil. Anyway, Clemens is by far, obviously, the standout character of the film. A character that was probably pitched as a Black Van Helsing, but amounts to so much more than the tired cliche of a vampire hunter with no motivation outside of slaying vampires and no more than a surface-level understanding of how a scientific man comes to believe in vampires. I released a blog post a little bit ago about how the Van Helsing archetype, as it has become, not how it was originally, but how it's become, has made the Dracula story so much less interesting, suffocating the life out of the characters in the cast, just giving more stuff to Van Helsing, who becomes so much less interesting. Anyway, a character like Clemens, as thoroughly explored as he is the answer to rejuvenating the Dracula mythos. Investing in the characters makes the movie good, what do you know? In conclusion, this is not a very traditional review, but what has become apparent in the years since this film is that it does one thing extraordinarily well that I haven't really seen anyone else comment on in the last 2 years. The few people that have actually watched the movie have revealed their grievances with the plot, characters, pacing, acting, and portrayal of Dracula, and though I, in comments on others' videos, have tried to disabuse them of some of their notions, I have to admit that some of their criticisms are legitimate. It is very strange that the movie treats this like a transatlantic voyage when they should have been able to stop at any port fairly easily the entire time. And I don't have an argument for why they decide to wait until nighttime to flush Dracula out when they know where he sleeps and have had a full day to plan their attack at the end of the film. I also find it quite strange that the film shows Clemens untying the captain from the wheel when he is supposed to be still tied up there when the ship makes landfall. And there's some changes I mentioned, but also other parts where it's so accurate to the book. They mention the weather in the chapters, and the weather is a plot point during some of the kills and some of the dialogue scenes. But they change something. Anyway, through all of this, however, I have not forgotten the way the movie made me feel on a first viewing, and I have isolated exactly what about it has impressed me. I still do hold it up to be one of the best vampire films in the past few years, though we will also be discussing the new vampire film Sinners in a few weeks on this channel, so stay tuned for that. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video and are able, please like and subscribe and leave a comment if you have seen this movie or have any thoughts on it. This is our YouTube page, but you can also follow us on TikTok for shorter content, and we have a Facebook page, Plan 9 Crunch podcast and blog, as well as our traditional blog, plan9crunch.com. Thank you, and that's a wrap.